So the claim that I'm responding to is that human activity is the primary cause of global warming, and my opponent's secondary claims are that humans have generated an immense amount of CO2 that has resulted in climate change, and that the way we handle our food source increases the amount of greenhouse gases, and lastly, that population growth puts pressure on the amount of fossil fuel that is needed to meet the demand of the consuming population. In response to the first secondary claim that humans have generated an immense amount of CO2, my opponent mentioned that many fossil fuel burning processes like cars and power plants have increased CO2. However, nowadays there are other alternative methods to obtain energy like solar panels and electric cars. There are over now 20 gigawatts of solar panels operating in the US, and that can power 4.6 million US homes, so that's a lot of people that is running solar energy through their home instead of fossil fuel, and that is coming from the Fortune magazine. Also, in reference to cars, over their lifetime, battery electric vehicles produce far less global warming pollution than their gasoline, and over 2/3 of all Americans now live in areas where they drive electric vehicles, and that has produced fewer climate emissions. This is according to the Union of Concerned Scientists, and yes, that is a real union. In 2016, 64,000 electric vehicles were sold, and sales have been increasing up to 90,000 within the last year, and this is according to an article written by Matt Kippelston. My opponent also mentioned that deforestation is increasing CO2, but forests cover over 31% of the world's land surface. That's over just 4 billion hectares, and 1 hectare is 2.4 acres. So I do believe that deforestation is a problem, but it's not a problem for increasing CO2. And like my opponent said, carbon dioxide is a heat-trapping gas, so alone carbon dioxide can be creating global warming, and it can be because it can be caused by natural processes like breathing or like volcanic eruptions, and there are 8 billion people in the world that breathe in and out, and that is releasing carbon dioxide. Going on to the second claim that the way we handle our food increases the amount of greenhouse gases, my opponent mentioned that livestock manure is creating methane gas, and as well as the fertilizer that we use in agriculture is creating excessive amounts of nitrogen that is also going into what is called the greenhouse effect. However, research now suggests that grazing cattle is now offsetting global warming by stimulating soil to take up more carbon from the atmosphere, and this process is known as soil carbon sequestration. And this is one way of reducing the amount of human-induced greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And this is coming from Daisy Dune from Carbon Brief. So even if livestock and agriculture is creating an increase in greenhouse gases, scientists are already working on reducing the amount of gases that are being released. Lastly, my opponent's last claim is that population growth puts pressure on the amount of fossil fuel that is needed to meet the demand of the growing population. My opponent mentioned that there will be a drastic increase in the usage of fossil fuels and gas emissions, but it seems to be more of a hypothetical since there are new alternatives to lower the production of gases. Alex Wu, a climate change research scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, conducted a study that was published in the Nature Climate Change, and she attempted to predict the climatic effects of solar rays and found that in a low carbon scenario, in which the global greenhouse emissions would decline after the year 2020 because there is now more renewable energy sources. And also the Earth's temperature depends on the energy entering the atmosphere and the energy leaving the planet system. So when incoming energy hits the Earth warms, and when energy is absorbed by space, Earth cools. So there are many factors that can contribute to temperature, both human and natural, but even if there was no human activity, the temperature, there would still be climate change due to the fact that there are variations in the sun's energy, infrared and visible wavelengths reaching Earth, and this is coming from an article called Advancing the Science of Climate Change. So I believe that naturally Earth's temperature is changing due to solar radiation coming from the sun. There can be contributing factors both from human and natural, but climate change is bound to occur. Human activity is not needed because it is something that is already happening naturally. Thank you.
Well, I think that you acknowledge the point that human activity is likely to contribute to CO2 in the atmosphere, but you attempt to mitigate it by arguing that there are alternative energies available and that the alternative transportation is coming available, and that as a result it's going to be less likely that we have those particular outcomes. I thought it was interesting that on the third point you actually have some point where it measures it and says after 2020 it's going to go down, so it feels like that probably should have been included on that first point as an unbalanced statement in regard to those sorts of things. There's not really much discussion of what the advocate's evidence and reasoning was on that particular point. I don't think there's much dispute that there is an impact of CO2 from human activity. The question is, how significant is that impact? Is it enough to change the climate in a way that is dangerous or hazardous? I don't remember that the advocate talked about any of those issues. There were just a lot of presuppositions built in there. You do talk a little bit about other sources of these problems down when you get to the third point, and I think that is something that could be applicable on all of the points. Like I said, I thought you had pretty good information on the alternative energy and the cars. Some predictions about what's going to happen in the future would make that argument a little bit stronger. On the second point, you've got an interesting point that you're presenting, suggesting that there are ways to mitigate this again, and in fact, you could have an unbalanced benefit if we're producing our meat using these techniques that are being described here, the soil carbon sequestration idea that you discussed, I think is an interesting one. I don't know how widespread that is. I don't know whether it's effective enough to be used and replace the concentrated animal feeding operations that we use currently, but at least it is a challenge to that particular point. And then the third point, you basically suggest that there's a whole variety of factors that influence climate change, and I think that that's good too. There is one thing that you need to consistently change on everything, and that is the citation of the evidence. You always want to give the citation first, you're always giving it afterwards, and that's a little bit of a problem. All right, thank you.